Hello everyone, and welcome to another Far Carrier video. Today we're going to talk about the upcoming American US CV changes. Or I say upcoming, what I really mean is they've been hinted at by the Let's Battle on the USS Lexington just recently. There's also been the World of Warships development blog on Facebook, which now has the details of the American Caroline changes, and also has the details of upcoming damage control party possible changes, which adds a lot of new mix. It's something new for carriers. Super excited about that. So without further ado, let's go into the details. We'll take it one tier at a time. We'll talk about the plane stats, the changes, the module changes, what the ship, how the new American ship would compare on paper versus randoms, ranked, competitive, that type of stuff. And and then at the end of that, we'll also talk about damage control party changes and how it will affect being shot at and fire control, and also things like carrier sniping at different tiers. So, without further ado, let's go straight into it and talk about the first ship to be changed, the Bogue. So here we have the Bogue, standard Bogue, and first things first, let's have a look at the upcoming Bogue change. Boom! Here we go. Bogue. Is we'll move myself out of the way. So what do we know about the Bogue right now? Well, the Bogue was an oddity in that the Independence and the Langley, which is the tier 4 and the tier 6, both had a torpedo bomber, dive bomber, and fighter 111. For whatever reason though, the Bogue came in with just one fighter and one torpedo bomber, which was weird. And another strength of the Bogue was that it gave you a fighter setup, which was 2 fighters and 1 dive bomber. And the madness was that everyone wouldn't go with the strike setup. They would go with the fighter setup. And the fighter Bogue, because at tier 4 in Wargaming's infinite logic, they removed alternate attacks, strafes. Even with strafes, the Bogue was a monster. The double fighters could lock at everybody. And as a Japanese CV in the Zuiho, nobody's having fun here. You can't do anything with your dive bomber to influence the game in terms of attacking things. You maybe reset caps in the old fighter setup, and the bomber people got locked out, and it wasn't fun, and people consider it cancers, which fair enough it was. But so now we're doing away with all of that, and we're going with 111. So to be honest, when I played the Bogue before they removed the alt attacks, I used to play 1-1 as well. Now I've got an extra dive bomber. It gives you an alternate source of damage over time, fire, along with the flooding of the torpedo bomber. Yeah, this is pretty good. You know what? This is not bad. The planes themselves are staying untouched, so if we have a look at the aircraft in the modules, we'll see that we're probably keeping our tier 5 fighters, which would be interesting if they're being unchanged because it's just useful, they're fairly good. And we're keeping tier 6 torpedo bombers and tier 5 dive bombers. It's actually pretty tanky with the tier 6s. Huh. But anyway, 111 is a buff to the Bogue. And the thing is, the Bogue's main rival will be the Zuiho, and there'll be a one-on-one fighter scenario. And until strafing mechanics come back or something changes, the one American fighter will outmuscle the one Japanese fighter. And the Japanese carrier has tier 6 planes, whereas the American one's tier 5, and this is at the tier 5 bracket. The problem here is with the captain skill known as Dogfighting Expert, which gives 10% extra damage between the tiers. So the Bogue not only has more planes, 7 in a wave compared to 5 of the Zuiho, it's also going to have the extra dogfighting experience, so it's just going to walk all over the Zuiho, but at least it's only 1 fighter, not 2 fighter, encouraging a more consistent playstyle from Langley to Bogue to Independence, right? So, all in all, the Bogue change is pretty good. It's a buff. You're basically getting a dive bomber for free. That's fine. Okay, so, moving on to our next ship, the old Independence. We see here that Independence, we're taking away the fighter setup, and we're taking away the strike setup, and are just keeping the bog standard balanced 111. Okay, so what's the difference here? Well, if we notice over to the right, the plane, this chap up here, this is a tier 7 dive bomber, and that's it. So your 111, the Independence was good, and I will go back into the game here and show, because it was the last American carrier that could compete this was the last American carrier that could compete with its Japanese counterpart. So there are no other tier 6 carriers, there's only 2 of them, and he had to fight the Ryujo. Now a 1-2-2 Ryujo, which you normally play in randoms, the Independence is good against because its single fighter, this is when you have the alt attacks and its strafe mechanic, can deal with the Ryujo one very clearly. And at the tier 6 bracket, the Independence and the Ryujo only have 2 waves. So the first wave that you send out, and then the second replenishment wave, and that's it. So as a result, the fact that you have this one fighter that could outmuscle the Japanese, you could win the air battle relatively quickly because there's only 2 waves of enemy fighters, and then you could start working on or strafing his bombers. So the Independent was quite strong. Plus I had 1 torpedo bomber and 1 dive bomber, which were both at tier 6. Okay, so it's pretty good in that respect. And you could do fire and flooding on targets. It's not as good as the cross-dropping of the Ryujo, the 2 torpedo bomb waves. It's not as good as having multiple sources of flooding and fire, but you get that little bit of extra air control, and you can still do reasonably well with your kind of offensive capability. When it went into ranked battles, the 3 fighters of the Ryujo, the 3-1-1 setup, meant it had a choice of flooding, a choice of fire, and 3 fighters, will always outmuscle 1 fighter group. 1 fighter can deal with 2 fighters, and 2 fighters can deal with 3 fighters, that being the higher number here being Japanese plane waves. But if only a single plane wave on the Independence, it's not going to be viable in any future ranked season or any future competitive seasons, because there's too many waves on the Japanese line, so it can have more map presence, and it doesn't get its fighter setup anymore. And because it loses that second fighter wave, even if you were to... I mean, there are lots of fixes. There are ways I would change this, so we'll talk about that at the very end. What would I do differently for each tier? We'll come back to that, right? But ultimately, it's going to suffer. In randoms, perfect. Absolutely great, and that's what this is. It's all temporary fixes. But against higher tier stuff, the lack of the second fighter means that in the tier 6 bracket, the 3 fighter setup Ryujo is still going to dominate in more organized forms of competition. Okay. So let's move on to the Ranger. Go. So the Ranger is where things start to become a little bit more interesting, in that we're keeping the planes up here, so the tiering of them is not changing, but the 1-1-1 Ranger is now changing to 1-1-2. The fighter setup is being removed, okay, and the strike setup, no fighters, is also being removed. Now, there is a strike setup for every carrier class without fighters from tier 5 right up until tier 8, and then you start getting fighters in the 9s and 10s. The strike setup always encouraged a selfish form of gameplay. How much damage can I do before the enemy CV locks me out? Or can I do more damage than he does? Or what, you know, and the problem here is because you don't have any fighter planes, you can't deny sight, you can't provide sight with the fighter planes, you can't protect your own bombers. You're relying on the mercy of, is the enemy carrier player doing the same as me? Is he playing strike? Is the enemy carrier player a bad player? What is the enemy AA gun setup? How many targets are there? Can I just... Because the offensive capability of a strike carrier was very, very high. But you were incredibly selfish in what you're doing. The Air Superiority Ranger gave you complete air control. Now the tier 7 bracket, there's 4 carriers at tier 7. And the Air Superiority Ranger was by far the most dominant of them. Now, the Ranger, which we'll go back into the game here, because we have 1-1-2, so we can go back and have a look at some stats here. The Ranger's fragile in the carrier sniping sense that it has no bulge protection, right? But in terms of its fighter planes, it gets waves of 7. Now, against the counterparts at tier 7, which we'll just show, we have the 3-1-2 Hiryu, or the 2-2-2 Hiryu. We have the the 2-2-1 Kaga, and that's with the lower tier 6 fighter planes. And then we have the Saipan. Saipan usually would run 2-2-0, 2 fighters, 2 torpedo bombers, and 0 dive bombers, or would run 3 fighters, 1 dive bomber. Now, that's a really powerful dive bomber. Now, the issue here is that the 2 fighter Ranger with the 2 7 plane wave groups, although it only had 2 dive bomber waves and it was a very little limited impact on the game, it did sort of technically work in a competitive rank, not a rank scenario because you can't be as organized, but if it was competitive at tier 7, then you could use the Ranger simply because it has pretty good air control. the Saipan's ability to strafe and exit strafe is really irritating, but the firepower of the Ranger's plane waves was good. In fact, you can tag and strafe and use multiple waves. It was definitely a power of the Ranger in your superiority, but it was not enjoyable for random, and if anything, these changes are really directed at random changes in random battles. And it's not supposed to be some overarching mega CV rework. This is kind of like a hotfix. So the fact that they're giving you an extra dive bomber now is good. The strike capability of the Ranger with 1 torpedo bomber wave and 2 dive bomber waves at tier 7 is enough to deal with enemy carriers if you are forced to. The problem with 111 on the Ranger was that the enemy Hiryu could snipe you. The enemy Kaga could snipe you in 1 bomb wave. The enemy Saipan could snipe you in 1 bomb wave if all these 6 torpedo bombers would hit you. The Ranger couldn't retaliate, so you had to, in the same way, you'd have to take multiple waves, or you'd have to rely on a flooding and then a fire mechanic with the 111. But now with 112, you can defend yourself and you can counter carrier snipe. And it actually might be quite fun, and I'm probably going to be looking forward to trying this when it comes out. The problem is, just like with the Independence, with a 3-fighter setup Japanese carrier, the Ryujo, the 3-fighter setup on the Hiryu or the 3-fighter setup on the Saipan will lock out the Ranger entirely. The 112 Ranger is going to be completely locked out. So if we have another tier 7 ranked or competitive meta, the Ranger unfortunately will not be picked because it doesn't have the fighter control. And that's kind of an awkward, and even if you didn't have the 3-fighter Hiryu or the 3-fighter Saipan and you only had a 2-fighter Saipan and a 2-fighter Hiryu, the problem is still you can outmuscle the enemy planes, but you need to use your strafe mechanics. If you simply click on the planes, you will win the engagement, but you need to be highly observant for exit strafes or incoming strafes, and if you use your strafes right, it's very powerful. And so I'm looking very forward to the Ranger. It's definitely a welcome buff. It's better than nothing. And it's good in randoms, but it's not good in a competitive or ranked scenario. Okay, and now we'll move on to the tier 8, Lexington. And this is where things get actually really interesting as well. So this Lexington has the Nobilium kind of camo change around. But if I show you now the stats over here. So the Lexington, what's changed with the Lexington? Well, interestingly enough, it's very similar to what's happened to the Ranger. We've gotten rid of the fighter setup, we've gotten rid of the strike setup, and the stock setup, and the only setup, is now 112. The difference has, as you can see over here, it is using tier 8 planes, and you have a choice to swap from high explosive to armor piercing bombs. So that's very interesting. And if I go back to the game, we'll see why. Now, the nearest comparison to the Lexington is the Enterprise. The Enterprise is using armor-piercing dive bombers. The detail is what is the bomb itself for the Lexington, because with armor-piercing dive bombers that are retically wise quite accurate, this could be very, very powerful, and it's moving towards the line that we see that the Americans are focusing more on their dive bombers to do damage rather than the torpedo bombers. Yes, you can't cross drop as the Japanese, and there isn't the speed of the planes, and the Japanese planes are still faster, and they can still drop their payload and scout. There's more flexibility. So for example, the Shikaku can still drop its dive bombers, it can still scout around the map, and all of these extra fancy elements which the Lexington can't do. But on a 1-1-2 setup, the Lexington becomes viable again, because the 1 torpedo bomber, 2 dive bombers, especially if they're armor piercing dive bombers, can do serious damage. If they are the same amount of damage as the Enterprise dive bombers, any German battleship is screwed, right? And then there's a variety of select ships, cruisers and whatnot, that are also going to get messed up. But the beauty of it is not relying all on dive bombers. Like the Enterprise, it has a wave of torpedo bombers. Now, the Enterprise has 2 torpedo bomb waves, but they're such a weird, janky setup that you can only realistically kind of call them a kind of a 1 wave to reliably hit. But with the 1 torpedo bomb wave, it does mean that you can go after destroyers, you can go after cruisers, or you can do a follow-up attack if your dive bombers didn't kill off a target. That's actually pretty good. And the fact that you can keep roughly the same offensive capability as a strike CV, but get a fighter, is actually really, really powerful. Because the 1 tier 8 fighter of 7 planes is strong. It will outmuscle the Shokaku's fighter wave, the main opposition. Now that's 1. If you click on 1 on 1, it will win. Now if the 2 Shokaku fighter waves click on your 1 Lexington wave, then yes, the Japanese planes will outmuscle the American carrier's wave, which is why as the American carrier wave, you don't want that to happen. If you want to go on head-on strafes, it favors you. You have more damage, you have more health, you're more tankier. If you are clicked on a Japanese plane and the other one's incoming, you exit strafe into his plane wave, and provided you're at 6 or 7 planes, you will then maul that wave in a head-on pass as you exit. So good use of your ammunition, good use of strafing, and provided you don't strafe past these planes and he strafes in right behind you, you're going to be doing quite well. It does come down to player skill and using your fighter well. If you have played the Essex 1-1-3 setup, you'll probably know what I'm talking about here with the fact that the Taiho has 2 fighters and you have your 1 fighter and you're escorting your bombers and you're kind of using it aggressively. So it's a welcome improvement, it's good, but this is where it stings, because I would like all of the tier 8 ships, carriers included. Tier 8 is considered the meta for clan kind of competitions, tournaments, that type of thing. There is clan wars at tier 10, and I'm not going to deny that, but it's not fulfilling the same role. Wargaming definitely said it's not fulfilling the same role. If you want organized tournament, player different things, that's at tier 8 currently. And the annoying thing is that because the 3-1-2 Shokaku exists, the 3 fighters setup on the Shokaku is going to outmuscle the 1 fighter on the Lexington. And it's less about how much you can bomb at tier 8 in competitive battles, and even ranked battles at the matter, and it's more about how well you can do in a sort of scouting role. And see, the thing is, the Shokaku can cross-drop. If you go into ranked battles and you play 2-2-2 Shokaku, which was the case at tier 8, you can cross-drop destroyers. And that's very powerful to picking them off. And the dive bombers are quite accurate as well, and they're not RNG based. The problem with the Lexington is the high explosive dive bombers, they're much wider drop pattern, far more RNG. The AP dive bombers, if they're even more accurate, are not going to be damaging destroyers, which means you're relying on 1 torpedo bomb wave, which is much easier for destroyers to evade. And then you've got issues of organized AA and the plane health, and getting onto the target it's just a little bit more clunky. And this is where Wargaming needs to change their game setup, because you cannot have planes of multiple tiers or plane waves of multiple sizes. Because what would be good is if you had a 1-1-2 setup where the 1 fighter was tier 8 and then the other bombers were fine, but then you had a 2-1-1 setup, so that's 2 fighter waves, 1 torpedo bomber, 1 dive bomber, and the 2 fighter waves were, for example, tier 7, a la Enterprise, right? But unfortunately, the game mechanics don't allow, to my best of my knowledge, you to have tier 7, plane control setup and a tier 8 plane control setup. 2 tier 8 fighters with a 1 torpedo bomber, 1 dive bomber is what the Lexington used to be before, I think, 5.2 or something, like ages ago. That's what it used to be. But this was before strafe mechanics came into play. Now, giving 2 fighter waves with strafe mechanics makes the Lexington pretty darn powerful in randoms, and in competitive / ranked, the 2 fighter planes are okay, they're good, and in the current fighter setup of the Lexington, the 2 fighters allows it to compete against the 3 fighters of Shokaku, but the Shokaku has 3 fighters, it can spread over more of the map. And the other issue is that you've only got 2 dive bombers, which are still slow compared to the Japanese. So you can drop the payload, but at only 140 knots base with the bomb cruising speed, they still get caught up by the Japanese, so they can't scout by themselves. And you have no torpedo bomber, like the Shokaku has that 1 torpedo bomber, so you can't torpedo bomb destroyers and smoke, or try and hit things in a ranked or support scenario. So is this a good upgrade? Yes, absolutely. It makes the Lexington better. Will it annoy some people that like fighter air superiority? Yeah, it will. Is it viable in competitive or ranked? Unfortunately, no. But since most of the gameplay on this ship will be in randoms, this is fine. It is by no means a final resting, this is perfect. It is a stopgap solution that makes it better. And that's as much as we can ask for until the proper carrier rework, blah, 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 whatever it is, comes into play. Okay, so anyway, let's move on to the Essex. Right. Here we go. So the Essex, and I'm going to move myself back over again. Hello. So, this is interesting. Essex is 2-1-1, right? Now 2-1-1 Essex is good because for the first time, because you're running, if you're running 1-1-2, which will be the case for most of the carry line. Now you've only had a single fighter. The Essex at tier 9 is the first time that you get 2 fighter waves, and in the current game you get 2 tier 9 fighter waves, and against the Taiho, which is your main opponent, you get air control. You can dominate the skies. You can basically, provided you know what you're doing. There's a lot of bombing capability on the enemy Taiho, but the first time you've got dominant air control, right? So that's fantastic. Or you could go with a 3 fighter 2 dive bomber setup. The problem with the 3 fighter setup is that if you're the enemy Taiho and the enemy's using 3 fighters, you would use your dive bombers in a scouting role and you try and spread out the Essex. Plus, you're going back to the same problem that all the previous tiers have had with no torpedo bombers and only dive bombers, especially only high explosive dive bombers, that you are in the difficult situation where you're not doing enough damage. Let's be clear, the Taiho has 12 torpedo bombers in 3 waves and has 2 dive bombers. In terms of setting floods, setting fires, it's way better than the Essex in a fighter scenario setup. So it's all about whether or not the Essex can lock out the Taiho the whole game, or if the Taiho, because if the Taiho gets 1 good bombing wave in, the whole fighter setup of this Essex was pointless. You also then have 1-1-3, which is what most people played. They would sacrifice the extra fighter to get 2 dive bombers, which is recommended because then you go up to 5 plane waves. And that was good because you had the same offensive striking capability as to strike Lexington before, but now you had a fighter protection, and they gave you a much better influence in the game. However, the dive bombers were still high explosive, they were still large drop reticle, it was very hard to hit destroyers, you only had a single torpedo bomb wave, you couldn't cross drop targets, so you're typically going after larger targets, or cruisers, or anyone who's not necessarily paying attention, so you can catch destroyers off guard, but without a proper cross drop mechanic, a good DD player will escape, right? So swapping now to 2-1-2, that is currently the stock setup of the tier 10 Midway. Now 2-1-2 is good in that 2 fighter waves, perfect, multiple strafing options, locking, strafing, exiting, that type of stuff is fantastic. We're keeping 1 torpedo bomber and we're getting 2 dive bombers. But at what cost? And this is where the planes over here come into play. You'll see that the VOT F4U4 variant is crossed out, and the Douglas BTD1s are crossed out. This basically means it is keeping tier 8 torpedo bombers and tier 8 fighters. So the Essex is keeping its 2 fighter setup, but it's weaker than 2-1-1. So you're getting an extra dive bomber, but they're down tiering your fighters. Now, what does this mean? Well, the 2 fighters are still 7 plane waves. And against the Taiho that's using tier 9 fighters, your tier 8 fighters with dogfighting expert are going to be probably just powerful, but let's have a look in the game here briefly, right? Okay, so let's have a look at the Essex fighters. These are the tier 9 fighters here. Oh, let me move my webcam out of the way. So you see the fighters just above my head, right? These are the fighters up here. Now, if you can't read the stats here, I'll read them out to you. The tier 9 has a cruising speed of 178 knots and has a hit points of 2,407 with an upgraded captain. Its damage per time, or per second, is 77, right? The tier 8 is slower. It's 9 knots slower, which makes it 169 knots. Now, that's awkward because the dive bombers are going to be much harder to catch against the Taiho, cutting them off. And if I'm fairly certain, the Taiho's torpedo bombers are actually pretty quick. 156, yeah. There's a definite speed increase, yeah. So the problem here is that the Essex fighters at tier 8 may just be fractionally too slow. The health pool drops down to 2,142. It gets more ammunition, but it loses 8 DPS. Now, the 8 DPS loss will be made up by Dogfighting Expert. So you have 7 fighter planes with Dogfighting Expert against the tier 9 Taiho planes. You're still going to win in a click-on engagement. When you click on against the enemy Taiho in a one-on-one fight, 7 versus 5, you're going to win that. In a strafing mechanic, your DPS is less, because I'm fairly certain in strafe mechanics it just does set damage. The dogfighting expert doesn't trigger during strafe, but the strafe is still powerful, right? So that's fine. The more ammunition is welcome, but the speed is an issue. And then the other issue is the hit points. When you down tier fighters, case in point, when you down tier the Kagas fighters from 7 to 6, when you down tier let's say the Zeppelin's fighters from 8 to 7, or you down tier the Enterprises from 8 to 7, you're keeping them in a bracket that has higher AA. So the Essex, I guarantee you, is going to come across tier 10 AA, and it's going to have tier 8 fighters, 2 tiers down. And that means that when you are inside enemy AA bubbles, when you use your fighters to scout, or if you choose to fight enemy fighters inside enemy AA bubbles, you will suffer. It's the same thing with the Hiryu and, say, the Saipan. The Hiryu's tier 7s will have less health than the Saipan's tier 9s, but with Dogfighting Expert, it's a balanced matchup. But as soon as anti-air comes into the play, the Saipan's planes are more resilient because of their higher health pool, whereas the Hiryu's ones will falter because they're far more fragile. And this is what's going to happen with the Essex. The fighters will be fragile, especially when it comes into enemy AA bubbles, but when it's fighter-on-fighter engagements, down-tiering them to 8 is okay-ish, provided you take Dogfighting Expert. Okay, so in that respect, but because you get 2 waves, rather than 1 wave, you now get a second wave, it's still probably okay. It's still probably a good buff, but it's kind of like it's giving with 2 hands and taking away with 1. It's like take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's kind of it's a buff and a nerf. It's a bigger buff and a smaller nerf, right? The other issue is that the torpedo bombers are now steering tier 8 as well. You're not getting the tier 9 torpedo bombers. You're getting the tier 8 torpedo bombers. Now, I play tier 8 carrier all the time, and I always get matched into tier 10 games, which means my tier 8 planes are always fighting against tier 10 AA. Always. Or significantly more than when I don't get like high. I'm not top tier. I don't fight against tier 6s. I fight against way more tier 10s than I do against tier 6s. And the issue here is that they're much slower. They're 14 knots slower. The tier 8s are slow. The hit points are 278 less. But I have to stress here, the Essex is only saving graces, just like the Enterprise. It gets the module upgrade, which increases the strike plane's health by 15%. So it is still better than the tier 8 planes on the Lexington, but it's still a nerf. And you're only keeping 1 torpedo bomber wave. So you're getting better fighters that are slightly nerfed. You're nerfing your torpedo bomber wave. Compared to 113, you're paying a high price to get that second fighter plane wave, because your torpedo bombers are now slower and less health. Which, and let's be clear, slower versus the Taiho. The Taiho has fast fighter planes. If we check the Taiho's fighter planes out, they go 176 knots. 176 knots versus the Essex's tier 8 fighters, 169 knots. Right? And against the torpedo bombers at tier 8, 136 knots. These are pretty big differences in terms of interception, so you're going to have to protect your bombers. And then, of course, the problem is when you fly into enemy AA bubbles, not only is your health less, but because you're slower, you're inside that AA bubble longer before you get to drop. So I'm not sure about the torpedo bombers against cruisers or high AA battleships, Iowas, that type of stuff. But against maybe ships that might not have defensive fire, against destroyers, or as a supplementary attack, it's good. I don't think the torpedo bomber is going to be the main source of damage. The main source of damage, I think, is what Wargaming is trying to push as we look back here, are these bombers. If you look over here, we've got the Douglas BTD-1, that is tier 9 dive bombers, so it's keeping the dive bombers, and it's getting AP dive bombers at tier 9. So it's getting 2 tier 9 dive bombers, and it gets the AP choice. Now, the high explosive was always the supplementary damage. It's a reasonable amount of damage because it's a 1,000 pound HE bomb, and you would use the torpedo bombers and the HE with a mixture of flooding and whatnot. So it keeps the speed. It's 151 knots, which makes it the fastest bomber. And with the AP, the question is here, what type of armor-piercing bomb is it using? Is it using the Enterprise armor-piercing bomb, or is it using something better? And then what is the drop pattern of the armor-piercing dive bombers? This is also very important in a balancing issue, because the real damage can be done with the armor-piercing dive bombers. You can absolutely smash battleships and use the torpedo bombers as some sort of supplementary damage, just like you did on the Lexington, and I guess to an extent to the Ranger. But there's unknowns. How good is the dive bombers going to be? How good is this armor piercing? But the problem is, the armor piercing dive bombers are not going to do much to cruisers unless they have good penetration mechanics, and they're going to do nothing to destroyers, assuming you even hit them because of the size and the elliptical pattern. The question is, are you going to do damage? No. So that's where the torpedo bomber comes into play. It's going to have to do some work against destroyers. But with the upcoming destroyer changes that give them defensive fire and much more damage output with their AA, I'm not entirely sure about the Essex. I like the 2-fighter setup. I like the air control setup. I'm not thrilled about making it tier 8, especially going into enemy AA bubbles. The tier 8 torpedo bombers hurts. I'm not sure how that's going to go, but giving the dive bombers armor piercing is interesting. But the other key thing here is that you're taking away the multiple sources of damage over time. There's no fires, and you've only got flooding. So you can't trigger one to get trigger damage control party to do with the other one. So I'm kind of on the wall here whether or not this is an improvement. When I was asking for changes, I was saying make this 2-1-2 and keep them at tier. Now 2 tier 9 fighter planes was fine because it was 2-1-1 originally, and to make it 2-1-2 you're getting an extra high explosive dive bomber. Because they want to use armor piercing dive bombers, they felt it necessary to weaken the torpedo bomber and the fighters. I'm undecided about this. This could actually be an overall nerf. It's to be seen. Watch this space. We will see. Okay. Moving now over to ye old Midway. Let's have a look at what have they done. Well, Midway used to have, and that's actually wrong up here, it didn't used to have 2-1-1, it used to have 2-1-2, all at tier 10. We used to have the fighter setup, which was 3-0-2. We used to have the strike setup, which was 1-1-3, and now we're getting a 2-2-2 Midway. Okay? Now, there's some caveats here. In a random scenario, 2-1-2 was the way I personally would play. I wasn't going to sacrifice a tier 10 fighter for a tier 10 dive bomber. A 1-for-1 trade isn't worth it. Having the 2 tier 10 fighters was better, gave you air control, and it's one of the defining factors that made the Midway good. Against the Hakuryu, who has only 2 fighters as well, your 2 American fighters are very powerful, they're very tanky, and they're very effective. So that's great. Clan battles has started, and interestingly enough, for the first time, the Midway with its fighter setup, its 3-0-2 setup, is actually good for Clan Wars. I was practicing in the CCT, which is the closed clan testing for Clan Wars before they decided to remove carriers, and the 3-0-2 Midway can fight against the Hakuryu's 4-2-2. Because everyone was running for Hakuryu 4-2-2 in the closed clan testing. But we tried the Midway's 3-0-2, and the 3 fighters of the Midway are more powerful than the 4 fighters from the Hakuryu. The bigger plane wave, the more ammunition, the beefier strafing. We can talk about clan testing and what we tested, but we can't talk about specifics on the clan. But anyway, that's the point. That's what we tested, and I personally found that the 3-0-2 Midway was better in the clan war / competitive setup, which bums me out that they're going to take it away. Now, in randoms, the 3-fighter Midway is totally not fun at all, period. It's so cancerous. As a Hakuryu, what you would do is you would drop the dive bomber's payload on the Hakuryu, and you would fly over the map, and you'd basically try and spread the Midway out, and he would go chasing after the fighter plane, the dive bombers that drop their payload, and then you'd use your 2 Hakuryu fighters with your torpedo bombers, and you'd go after any target of opportunity. And that was the counter to someone going fighter. But in a random game, Midway isn't going to do a lot of damage because it's only got 2 dive bombers, and that's kind of rubbish. And it's just like the old fighter Essex. You have really good air control, but you can't bomb. But the air control means nothing if your friendly ships and the enemy ships get within inside each other's anti-air bubbles, and that means the enemy carrier can just attack, and you can't necessarily protect, because if you coming in to protect, your fires are getting shot down by enemy AA. So fighter CVs aren't necessarily great, but lack of a competitive clan war setup, even though I know carriers are not in clan wars, is kind of awkward and kind of painful. So, what are we getting? Well, we're getting 2-2-2. Alright, so we're getting 2-2-2. This is interesting. What are the planes? Well, we're keeping the tier 10 fighters. That's great. So unlike the Essex is down tiering the fighters by 1 tier, we're keeping our tier 10 fighters. And the torpedo bombers, we're losing our 9s, we're losing our 10s, we've got 2 tier 8 torpedo bomber waves, and we're keeping our tier 10 dive bombers, and we're getting an armor piercing variant. Okay, so this is interesting. The Midway now is 2-2-2, and in randoms, thinking this purely of randoms, 2 tier 10 fighters against the 2 tier 10 Japanese fighters, you definitely have air control. Alright, so you definitely have air control. That is unquestioned, right? Nobody in their self-righteous mind is going to choose 4-2-2 Hakuryu in randoms. If they are, they're a complete idiot. And you can still kind of somewhat outmuscle them or use your A favorably. If you come across... You're never going to come across a fighter Midway again because they'll be removed. So you're only ever going to come across enemy 2-2-2, so it's balanced, or 4-2-2 Hakuryus, which is never going to happen. It's going to be 2-3-3 because they're going to be trying to bomb, okay? So with that in mind, you are going to dominate air control. You can, in open areas outside of AA bubbles, you have complete air control. The 2 dive bombers, well, currently the Midway stock is 2-1-2, so the 2 dive bombers isn't unchanged. That is good. I am enjoying this. The fact that I'm now getting an armor piercing variant is interesting because they're trying to push their dive bombers to be probably the main damage source. So what is the armor piercing values? What is the penetration values? What is the reticle? Just like what we said with the Essex and Lexington, the armor piercing details are very important. How much damage does it do to tier 10s? Can it damage cruisers, like the earlier Graf Zeppelin tests? Is the reticle accurate enough to inconvenience destroyers to reset a cap? And then the issue here is, this is the first carrier in years that we're getting a second torpedo bomber squadron again. And provided they don't change the drop pattern, it's 2 groups of 6 planes in the old Midway drop pattern. But it's at tier 8. However, we've already said that we're keeping the strike module that gives 15% plane attack. 2 torpedo bomber waves against a ship that doesn't have the highest AA values, or is not paying attention, or doesn't focus fire, is devastating. Truly devastating. If you can make these 2 torpedo bomber waves get on target, a Yamato for example, that's punishing. A Kurfürst even, that's huge. That's going to be absolutely brutal. But it's tier 8 and planes melt. So if anyone's anti-air spec is focused firing you or defensive firing, you're going to get wrecked. Now, let's talk about destroyers. Could you use cross-dropping torpedo bombers on destroyers? Absolutely. And it will be murder against destroyers. Specifically ones that don't have a defensive fire. So maybe the German ones, maybe the Japanese ones. Anybody of those destroyers that have a defensive fire, the Groznevoy, the Gearing, that's up for debate. Because the defensive fire will cause the panic effect, and because they're tier 8, and because the multiplier on the destroyers that have defensive fires are going to be increased, you probably see your entire wave just fall apart and melt. So it's interesting, and even Akizuki's at tier 8, their AA is so high, they will melt the planes. So provided they use their focus fire on their anti-air by clicking on your planes, they'll probably melt apart. But if you husband your strength with torpedo bombers, the gameplay is very similar, I think, to the Hiryu, in that the Hiryu has down tier 6 torpedo bombers versus in the tier 7 bracket, but it's tier 6, which makes them more fragile. But if you husband their strength and you're very careful with how you use them, how you approach enemy A bubbles and what targets you go after, they do a lot of damage. They're very, very powerful. And I think this will be the same case for the Midway, which is going to be really interesting. So, am I thrilled about the Midway changes? Hell yes, I'm super stoked about how the Midway changes are going to be. I can probably work with the down tier torpedo bombers. The fact that the fighters are staying up tiered and the dive bombers are staying up tiered and they're giving me an AP variant, and if the AP sucks, I can still work with the high explosive dive bombers. It's good choices. That's great. The Midway upgrade is fantastic. I'm actually pretty thrilled about that. Essex less so. Ranger and Lexington I'll probably play a little bit because I'm getting an extra fighter plane now to work with the bombers. But the Midway is out where it's at for me. The Midway is the one that's made it really strong. It can really go toe-to-toe, I think, with the Hakuryu. The only issue is the loading times for the planes on the Midway. It's obviously still much slower than the Hakuryu, so the Hakuryu can still turn around planes much faster than the Midway. So it's to be seen. We have to see what's going on there. But it is really interesting for me, and I like these changes. Now the real question is, when is this going to happen? So we're still waiting for word, and maybe we'll find out more information on this in 2 days from now, on Wednesday the 8th of November. There'll be a European stream where they're going to talk about the American carrier changes. What I want to know is, how long is it going to take to implement these changes? Because let's be clear here, Graf Zeppelin went through multiple flight module and plane changes and reticle and all that type of stuff every patch. So every 3 weeks we had changes. And we had test variants. There's no reason why we can't have test variants of the American carriers. There's no reason we can't have the test variants with the modules. And there's no reason why we can't have it in the next patch or the one after. I'm just trying to signify that the devs, when motivated enough, can turn around balances and introduce ships and then provide that out en masse quickly. So if they wanted to, we could have this next patch. Probably next patch. Or if that's already tied down the one after, we could have this in-game open for testing, and that would be really, really good. But what's the time frame here? It's one thing to tease it to us, like teasing French battleships or teasing Pan-Asian destroyers, but when is this going to happen? That's what I want to know about. Okay, now on to the other element today. So we'll bring that up because Wargaming loves to introduce lots of elements. Hello there. So I'll just move myself out of the way. Damage control party changes. Alright, so this is unrelated to the American carriers, but related in the same sense because the strike capability of the Ranger and Lexington is being tweaked, along with the Essex and Midway. So what does the damage control party mean? Okay, I'm not a super, and by the way, when it comes to testing, I'm not a super tester for carriers, so we'll just have to wait and see how the testing happens. But, moving on, the damage control party consumable chance of catching fires for carriers. In a nutshell, if you want to read this, it means that the damage control party, that is the ability that removes flooding, repairs all your stuff, takes away fire, no longer lasts 5 seconds, it now lasts 30 seconds. That is a really big buff to carriers. The next element is your chance of catching a fire from high explosive shells is now equal to tier 6 base carrier hulls. Okay, so, and then they say this will lower the need for carrier commanders to hunt down other carriers. What they're trying to say is we're making it harder to snipe. They're basically saying, we're making it harder to snipe, so you shouldn't snipe. And you think Wargaming, you'd learn by now, I'm really good at sniping enemy carriers, this isn't going to stop me. New move. But moving on with a little bit more, there's a bigger chance to catch fire from smaller caliber guns on higher tiers. So what does this mean for higher tier ships and lower tier ships? Well, there's a key difference from tier 8 up and tier 7 below. From tier 8 up, there's a defensive fire mechanic. The defensive fire mechanic causes a panic effect on planes that makes it very difficult to attack carriers. Carriers also have really crazy high levels of anti-air, and if you have a 19-point captain like I do in most of my high-tier carriers, you can also melt planes so quickly that it's not worth attacking a carrier. That being said, however, going tier 7 and under, they do not have the defensive fire capability. Alright? Now, this means that carrier sniping at tier 7 is a much greater risk and threat. And there's also dual carrier games at tier 7 and under. At tier 8, 9, and 10, you do not get 2 carriers per team, so it's 1 versus 1. But tier 7 and low, you can get 2 versus 2, and you can get mixed tiers, so you can have 6 and a 7 or 5 and a 6 against, again, mirror matching on the enemy team. So carrier strike's totally a doable thing, especially without defensive fire. And if we take this one step further, what does this mean? Well, the interesting thing is that increasing the fire chance on the hulls is kind of irrelevant. If you are a CV, it's 8, 9, or 10, your increased chance of getting fire from shells is irrelevant because you're not. If you're not, you really shouldn't be being shot at in the first place. The fact you're being shot at and your rods of increasing fire, pretty much I go and fire whenever I get shot at and someone sneaks along anyway, so that's not a big deal. A destroyer that comes up to you and can set you on fire and guarantee that fire, okay, I can understand that. However, the damage control party, that's a 30-second window of immunity to land planes or, more importantly, take off multiple waves to defend yourself. This is good because before, the damage control party lasts 5 seconds, you could launch 1 or maybe 2 waves before the enemy ship then got you back on fire again. So 30 seconds is a big window. Also, what does this mean in terms of anti-sniping mechanics? Well, formerly in the Tier 8, and before they got defensive fire, and now in the Tier 7, if the Alpha Strike capability, and by Alpha Strike I mean attacking with all your bombers at once, wasn't enough to kill off an enemy CV, what you would do is you would bleed them dry. So for example, if I was playing a Hiryu, I would use my dive bombers and maybe 1 torpedo bomber to cause a fire and a flood effect on a ship, such as an enemy Hiryu, that's got good voltage protection, and then wait for the enemy carrier, who's forced to because he's flooding and on fire, to force his damage control party, and then follow up the second torpedo bomber and the second dive bomber 5 seconds later, reapply a fire and a flooding, and that person would burn and die out. The reason you would do this is because the Hiryu has relatively good bulge protection of 21%, and you can't kill it in one go. With the 2 waves of 4 of the torpedo bombers, assuming you don't lose any to anti-air, you might hit with 4 or 5, if you're lucky 6, and then with the 2 dive bombers, he can immediately damage control party and he will live the enemy Hiryu, but we're talking very low health, but he lives. You cannot Alpha Strike him, alright? So you need to bleed them out. This 30 seconds of immunity means that what is his fighters doing? Has he lost the fighter duel and this allows you then to attack? Because triggering fires means you can't take planes off. So 30 seconds of immunity to fire means the planes can take off, he can land, and then those fighters that take off can then defend himself. And you don't want to apply your bombs in that 30-second window because you want it for it to go away and then you want to attack him again. And you want to do this all in one wave because there's no point doing it in 2 waves because you're wasting a lot of time and resources trying to kill this guy. And usually that's detrimental to the effect of the team. So what it means is any ship that tries to do damage over a period of time is going to suffer. It's a nerf to them. But any ship that's got a high Alpha Strike, it's not a nerf. So if we take the Tier 7 bracket specifically into key, because at Tier 8, 9, 10, it's irrelevant. The defensive fire means you're never going to snipe them anyway. And it's kind of a buff to carriers now, because it means that when they're under fire and they're taking damage, they can use the damage control party in 30 seconds to get as many planes in the air as they possibly can to defend themselves. Okay? From Tier 7 down the way, you have the Hiryu, you have the Kaga, you have the Saipan, and you have the Ranger, right? And the Ranger is really vulnerable to being killed. It doesn't have bulge protection. Anything with torpedo bombers is going to kill it. Saipan is going to have a hard time because it needs to hit all 6 torpedoes perfectly to kill the Ranger. So unless the Ranger's taking some damage by somebody else, 5 torpedoes is going to take him down to about 10% health, but he's going to live. And he's going to damage control party any sort of flooding. And flooding can't be something you can rely upon even with signals for the Saipan, okay? The Hiryu on Hiryu action is not going to happen because there's no Alpha Strike, so it's kind of a nerf for them. So the Saipan and the Hiryu is kind of a nerf on both of them. But you know who buffs here immensely? The Kaga. The Kaga gets a huge buff in this scenario because while other people can't snipe the Kaga with flooding mechanics and damage mechanics over time because the Kaga has 51,000 health, come at me bro, it has the 2 mega torpedo bombers. It's got 12 torpedo bombers. It will smash the Ranger, absolutely smash him in a single Alpha Strike, and it will absolutely smash the Hiryu and the Saipan. If you can get those 2 torpedo bomber waves on target on those 3 CVs, you'll kill them dead. So it can Alpha Strike, which is why it's very good for the Kaga. And anyone who tries to kill the Kaga, it's got a lot of health, it can tank, it's very difficult to Alpha Strike. Even a Kaga on a Kaga, it's going to live, and it's going to do just fine. So buy more Kagas, increase your stocks in Kaga. Saipan-wise, you can't really carry... You can't CV snipe a Hiryu, you can't CV snipe the Kaga, the bulge protection is too high. You can barely CV snipe, as I said, the Ranger. Saipan on Saipan... you can't do either because the thing's too short, so that's not going to work either. And you can't realistically use 1 torpedo bomb wave, get a flooding, and then the next one. You have to kind of do it over 2 waves, which is typically why sniping with the Saipan on other ships is not done, especially when the guy's at full health. But if he's taking a little bit of damage, then you can go ahead and do it. So it's interesting. And then another interesting thing here slightly is that the Ranger now isn't 2 fighters, 2 dive bombers. The Ranger is 1 1, 2. Now, the dive bombers are still only the 500-pound variants, but they still do damage. And because you have a torpedo bomber, 2 dive bombers, and crucially here, you have a fighter plane to protect them, the Ranger is actually pretty good with the damage control party changes. When it comes to being up-tiered, if you're a tier 7 carrier and you're matched into tier 8, 9, 10s, or 8, 9s, often there isn't really anything you can attack on the enemy team except from the enemy carrier, because he's behind the enemy lines and he doesn't typically have a ship around him that's protecting while we're giving him defensive fires. So he's usually the target you can go for when the matchmaking's really bad and you can't go in for anything else while you wait for people to spread out. So having that fighter means the one Ranger fighter will outmuscle the 2 Kaga fighters. The one Ranger fighter with good control will outmuscle the 2 Hiryu fighters, and it might have a much harder time on the Saipan, but the Ranger can kill, it can alpha strike. The torpedo bomber wave of the Ranger is 6 torpedo bombers, just like the Saipan, but in one big block wave. You need to be careful with AA, but it does a ton of damage. If you get 4 or 5 torpedoes, you will absolutely clobber a Hiryu, a Kaga, a Saipan, or even an enemy Ranger, especially when the Ranger doesn't have any bullet protection. But then if you follow that up with dive bombers, the alpha strike from high explosive dive bombers, and this is 14 dive bombers because it's 2 waves of 7, and you get a good reticle over the target, you'll kill them. So interestingly, the Kaga and the Ranger are the 2 ones that are more likely to benefit from the damage control party. It's interesting. I'm actually really eager to play the Ranger with the damage control party changes and the module party changes. So we'll see. Anyway, that being said, it's positive that Wargaming is making the changes. The damage control party, I think, is an the damage control party is a good change. It's trying to be like an anti-sniping change, but it's not really, because there's certain ships that can do it and there's other ships that can't. If you go down to tier 6 and you look at the Independence and the Ryujo, it's a nerf to the Ryujo because you have to then rely on the alpha strike on the Independence, because before you would fire and flood, right? And on the Independence, you could torpedo bomb, then dive bomb, I guess. But you're not really getting full alpha strikes. That needs more testing. But there's another minor element I want to talk about here. There is an upgrade you can take, Damage Control Party Mod, which increases the damage control party time by 40%. Well, if it's a 30-second damage control party, this is a very tempting module to take, right? Tempting. However, as tempting as that is, I'm not sure you should take it, because Air Group Mod 1 is still 10% damage. That's basically a dogfighting expert. So it's tempting to take Damage Control Party 1, but I don't think you should. I don't think you should rely on passive skills. I think you should rely on proactive skills, and taking fighter damage is better than a 42-second damage control party. 42-second damage control party could be fantastic. You're being shot at and you need the planes to take off and you can do whatnot. It's very tempting. And maybe if you're a Japanese carrier who knows he can't get air control, you might go with it. But honestly, if you're taking a ton of damage, something has gone wrong, right? If you're vulnerable to alpha strikes, damage control party is not going to help you. If you're getting shot at by enemy ships, then you've done something wrong. And I'd rather go with the DPS, because if you're doing strafes, then fighter DPS is king, because you want to kill off planes as quickly and as hard as you can. With Dogfighting Expert or Air Groups Mod 1, I think it's more important than having an extra 18 seconds of damage control party, even though that's super tempting. It's to be seen, really. That's kind of interesting. Yeah. I'm looking forward to the changes, though. Anyway, I'm going to end this video now, because I know I've gone long. As and when we learn more, we'll make more updates and all that type of stuff. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Boom! Right, we're done. I'm going to highlight that and send that to YouTube's.